Just as with the lead uppercut, there are two primary ways to throw the rear uppercut. The first method is the standard rear uppercut, which I show here. It's a fast and sneaky punch because it is thrown directly from your stance. The second method is the power rear uppercut, which involves slipping to the outside of your opponent's body prior to throwing the punch. It can cause a lot of damage, but it is easier for your opponent to read due to the added movements. To execute the rear standard uppercut, I do several things simultaneously. 1. I pivot on the ball of my rear foot and rotate my hips in a counterclockwise direction. 2. I pull my left shoulder back, drop my right shoulder, and lower my right fist. 3. Continuing to pull my left shoulder back, I rotate my right hand so that my palm is facing me and throw my fist upward into my target. Notice how I have kept my left arm up to protect the left side of my face. The overhand is responsible for putting countless fighters to sleep in mixed martial arts competition. The mechanics of the punch is similar to a straight cross, but instead of throwing your fist straight out, you drop your opposite shoulder and extend your arm forward in a downward arc, similar to a swimmer's freestyle stroke. Due to its arcing trajectory, your opponent can't slip the strike by moving his head away from his center line, as can be done with straight punches. He can block the overhand with his arm, but it's not a very good option. If your hand slips through a crack in his protective shield, he will most likely go to sleep. And even when he manages to absorb the full impact with his arm, the power the overhand possesses will still cause him damage. Your opponent's best option when you throw the overhand is to quickly get out of the way, but by perfecting your timing and learning how to set up the strike, you can make that a difficult chore. To execute the overhand, I do several things sequentially. 1. Keeping my left hand up for protection, I come up onto the ball of my right foot, rotate my hips and shoulders in a counterclockwise direction, and slightly dip my left shoulder toward my left side. 2. I slightly shift my weight forward. 3. As I rotate my body and dip my left shoulder toward my left side, I connect with the side of my opponent's face using the knuckles of my index and middle fingers. To protect myself from counterpunches, I've not only shrugged my right shoulder and kept my left hand guarding my face, but I've also kept my head up and my eyes locked onto my opponent. If you drop your head or look at the mat, your ability to effectively follow up the overhand with another strike will decrease. This is an excellent technique to utilize when your opponent is injured or you can see that his face is vulnerable to strikes, but he has created distance between your bodies to avoid your strikes. To close the distance, you step your rear foot forward, and to deliver a powerful strike, you throw a cross while in mid-step. With your body moving forward, the cross has a lot more power than it does when thrown directly from your stance. Whether your opponent blocks the strike or gets hit, his most natural reaction will be to retreat backwards. To capitalize on that retreat, you step your rear leg forward again and throw another cross while in mid-step, which switches you back to your original stance. When your opponent is injured, it's possible to hit him with 3 punches in a row, but I don't recommend chasing him all the way across the ring using this technique. There's a good chance he will gather his senses and switch his linear movement to a side-to-side movement. This will cause you to move past your opponent, making you vulnerable to counter-strikes. So, I suggest practicing throwing 3 stepping crosses in a row, no more. This is the same technique as demonstrated in the previous sequence, only now you're using it as a counter. As your opponent charges towards you, you step your lead leg behind you and throw a jab while in mid-step. If your opponent continues forward, you repeat the process again on the other side to return to your initial fighting stance. However, it is important to notice that in this sequence, I only employ 2-step punches rather than 3. The instant you begin moving backwards, your opponent will most likely think you are on the run and increase his forward momentum. If you employ more than 2 back steps, he will often be able to overrun you and either land hard strikes or execute a takedown. To prevent this from happening, I like to execute 2 backstep punches to get my opponent to commit to his forward charge, and then utilize a pivot step to reposition my body off to my opponent's side. This causes his body to move past me, giving me a dominant angle of attack. When I fought Chris Lieben in the UFC, I used this exact technique as he rushed towards me with a series of punches. Instead of trying to hold my ground and dodge his strikes, I stepped back and threw punches. With all his momentum moving forward, my strikes landed considerably harder than they would have if he had remained stationary. In this section, you will not only learn how to parry your opponent's punches, but also use parries to launch a counter-strike. While a parry is a rather simple movement to execute, it requires tremendous timing and a sense of distance. For example, if your opponent throws a punch from just outside of punching range, it's possible to simply parry the punch by catching it in your palm. This requires very little movement on your part, and, if you have superior reach, allows you to immediately land a counterpunch. However, if your opponent throws a punch from inside of punching range or has a longer reach, you must use the parry to move his fist to the outside of your head in order to avoid his shot and land a counterstrike. In order to acquire this timing and a proper sense of distance, I recommend doing parrying drills as much as possible with different partners. Rear parry is a hand block that can be used to catch or redirect your opponent's straight punches. As far as movement is concerned, it's a fairly simple technique. The goal is to catch your opponent's fist in the palm of your hand as his arm reaches the end of its extension and redirect it to the outside of your head. The most difficult part is acquiring the proper sense of distance. If your opponent is just inside of punching range and he throws a straight jab at your face, catching his fist in your palm is enough to prevent his fist from connecting with its target. If your opponent is well inside of punching range when he throws the jab, you want to combine the rear parry with a slight slip. This is accomplished by using your rear hand to redirect his strike towards the outside of your head, while at the same time slipping your head towards the outside of his striking arm. Although the parry is a simple technique to understand, the only way to develop the proper sense of distance is through countless hours of drilling and sparring. I strongly suggest you invest that time because mastering this highly effective counter tactic is mandatory for becoming a proficient striker. In this sequence, I use a rear parry to evade my opponent's jab just as in the last sequence, but before he can pull his arm back into his stance, I counter with a jab of my own. There are 2 ways to pull this off. In this scenario, my opponent throws his jab from just inside punching range. As a result, instead of parrying his fist to the outside of my head, I simply catch it in my rear palm. However, if my opponent had a superior reach or threw his jab from well inside punching range, then I would need to parry his hand to the outside of my head and slip my head off my center line to avoid his shot. Either way, it is important to counter with the jab before your opponent can pull his arm back into his stance. I recommend practicing this technique as much as possible, both on the focus mitts and with a live partner. It is important to mention that when using the rear parry, you never want to reach your hand towards your opponent's punch. If you get into this bad habit, there is a chance your opponent will pick